They said my peaceful creek was a danger, forced me to drain it, tear it apart. They thought they'd won, but they forgot one thing. You can't fight nature, and you can't silence the truth. When the rains came, their million-dollar homes sank into the swamp they created. This isn't just a story about water. It's about what happens when you push too hard and the land pushes back. For years, the little creek that trickled behind my house had been more than just a patch of water. It was a lifeline. After long, grueling days fixing plumbing problems for customers all over town, I found my peace sitting beside it, boots in the water, letting the gentle sounds of nature wash away the stresses of life. Birds swooped overhead, dragonflies skimmed the surface, and every now and then, the neighborhood kids, like Timmy and Sarah Thompson, would wander over, laughing as they skipped stones or caught frogs. That creek wasn't just water. It was memory, healing, and history. It had carved its path through our land long before Riverstone Heights ever became a neighborhood, which is why the thick envelope I pulled from my mailbox one warm spring afternoon made my stomach turn before I even opened it. Maple Valley Homeowners Association, the corner read in fancy gold lettering. Confused, I slit the envelope open. Inside was a barrage of neatly printed documents, a welcome letter to the HOA, a set of community guidelines, and worst of all, a mandatory compliance agreement. They claimed that Riverstone Heights, once independent, had been absorbed by the Maple Valley HOA from the newer development next door. Tucked in small print was the kicker. Failure to sign constitutes acceptance of terms after 30 days. I slammed the letter down on the table. How could they do this without my consent? My house deed had been crystal clear when I bought it. No HOA nonsense. I resolved to ignore it, thinking surely it was just some bureaucratic mistake. That naive hope lasted precisely 3 days. One sunny afternoon, I answered a knock on my door to find a woman with gleaming white teeth and an unsettlingly perfect smile standing on my porch. She extended a manicured hand. "Good afternoon, I'm Karen Westfield, Community Standards Director for Maple Valley HOA. Without waiting for an invitation, she stepped forward, her clipboard poised like a weapon. "I noticed you haven't returned your membership agreement yet. I'm afraid this isn't optional." I stared at her. "My deed never mentioned an HOA. I've lived here 11 years. You can't just show up and change that." Karen's grin sharpened. "Actually, your deed contains a dormant provision. If 75% of homeowners in an area agree, an HOA can be activated. That threshold has been met." She handed me a highlighted section of my own property documents. Fine print I'd never noticed. I felt like the ground shifted under my feet. Still stunned, I mumbled, "I need time to review this." "No problem," Karen chirped, tucking the papers neatly back into her folder. "Oh, and one more thing. We'll need to address your unauthorized water feature." I blinked. "You mean the creek?" Karen's eyebrows lifted. "Natural or not, it's an attractive nuisance. Children could fall in. It violates safety standards." "But that creek has been there longer than any of these houses," I protested. Karen offered a syrupy smile. "We'll address it at the HOA meeting Thursday. Hope to see you there." I watched her stride away, already regretting signing anything. Thursday evening, I sat among a sea of baffled neighbors in a stuffy community center as Karen and her husband, Richard, now revealed as the HOA president, swept through a slick PowerPoint presentation. They spoke grandly of property value maximization and unified aesthetic policies, tossing out phrases like architectural harmony and community integrity. When Karen clicked to the next slide, my heart dropped. A massive photo of my backyard and my beloved creek filled the screen. "This unauthorized water feature," Karen said crisply, "poses a clear drowning hazard." I jumped to my feet. "That's not a water feature. It's a natural creek. It's barely 4 inches deep." Some neighbors murmured support, others looked uncertain. Mrs. Thompson, whose kids loved the creek, raised her hand. "My children play there all the time. It's shallow and safe." Karen's smile thinned. "And do you have liability insurance, Mrs. Thompson, in case something happens?" The room fell silent. Richard stepped forward. "For everyone's safety, we are requiring the creek to either be fenced off completely, with approved gates, or drained." Gasps echoed across the room. I sat down heavily, my mind spinning. It wasn't just about appearances. They were weaponizing fear, liability, safety, excuses layered on top of excuses, aimed at erasing something that didn't fit their cookie-cutter vision. That night, I stood by my creek, flashlight in hand, tracing its familiar path. The water shimmered under the moonlight, innocent and ancient. I wasn't just fighting for a patch of water anymore. I was fighting for a way of life. And deep down, I knew, if I didn't fight back now, the entire soul of this neighborhood would be washed away, just like they wanted to wash away the creek. The morning after the meeting, I woke to a sense of dread that clung to my skin, heavier than the humid spring air. I slipped on my boots and headed outside, half hoping I had dreamed the whole confrontation. No such luck. Pink flags marked the edges of my property, little plastic soldiers staked into the soil by the inspection team. Karen had promised tiny signs labeled "Unauthorized Water Feature, Pending Correction," peppered the grass like accusations. Standing at the creek's edge, I clenched my fists. It wasn't just a trickle of water they were threatening. It was the heartbeat of this land. Every stone, every tuft of wild grass, every frog croaking from the banks had been here before property lines and bylaws invaded. I knew then. I had to find a way to stop them. But it wasn't going to be easy. That afternoon, a certified letter thudded into my mailbox. Notice of violation. Failure to address water hazard. Deadline, 30 days. Penalty, $100 per day, if non-compliant. I barely had time to process that before Karen herself showed up again, clipboard in hand, and 2 board members trailing behind her like obedient ducklings. She didn't even knock. She just waltzed across my yard, snapping photos with her phone like a tourist on a sightseeing tour. "Morning, Mr. Jackson," she chirped without looking up. "Karen, you're trespassing," I said, voice tight. "Official HOA business," she replied, pointing to her laminated badge like it was a police shield. "We're documenting code violations." She sauntered down to the creek, her designer flats sinking slightly into the muddy bank. "Tisk, tisk, potential mosquito breeding ground," she muttered. "It's running water," I snapped. "Mosquitoes need standing water." Karen shrugged, jotting something on her clipboard. "Better safe than sorry. Plus, raccoons, disease vectors." I followed them grimly as they tromped through my vegetable patch, trampling my tomato plants without a second thought. "Vegetable gardens must not be visible from public roads," Karen said without even glancing at me. "This is my backyard," I protested. "It's visible from the side street," she answered, as if that explained everything. For nearly an hour, they cataloged every supposed infraction: wildlife sightings, invasive plant species, irregular landscaping. It was clear, they weren't just trying to fix the creek. They were building a case to drown me in fines until I either gave up or sold out. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, paperwork spread across every inch of wood, feeling the weight of 1,000 tiny battles piling onto my shoulders. HOA bylaws, property maps, county regulations. It all blurred together. Frustrated, I picked up the phone and called Marta Rodriguez, the only lawyer I trusted, the same one who had helped me settle my mother's estate after her passing. After I poured out the whole mess, she sighed heavily on the other end. "Technically," she said, "if your neighborhood was properly incorporated into the HOA and your deed has the dormant clause, yes, they can enforce aesthetic and safety standards, even on natural features like a creek." "But this isn't just a koi pond or a bird bath," I argued. "It's part of the natural watershed." "I know," Marta said gently, "but in HOA law, visibility often trumps logic, and fighting them in court could take years and tens of thousands of dollars." I slumped back in my chair, feeling the walls closing in. "Isn't there anything I can do?" There was a long pause. Then Marta said carefully, "Maybe if you can prove that altering the creek would create greater harm, flooding, environmental damage, the county might get involved, but you'd need hard evidence." The next day, determined not to roll over, I set out to find that evidence. I traced the creek backward, climbing upstream beyond my property line. To my surprise, I discovered a hidden drainage pipe feeding into the creek, a man-made pipe buried behind cattails. It wasn't natural runoff. It was runoff from the new development, from Karen and Richard's neighborhood. Fury rose inside me like a flood. Following the pipe with my flashlight, I found it led directly from a shiny new retention pond built behind the Westfields' home. And as I crouched there in the shadows, I saw something else. Richard himself, sneaking out at dusk to pour a suspicious dark liquid into the pond. Snapping quick photos with my phone, my heart hammering, I backed away. This wasn't about child safety. This wasn't about mosquitoes. This was about them, the HOA board, quietly shifting environmental problems from their shiny new homes onto my land. And now they were trying to kill the last natural defense my property, and maybe even the entire neighborhood, had left. I barely slept that night, a new fire burning in my chest. They thought draining the creek would solve their problems. They had no idea that by destroying it, they were about to unleash a flood they couldn't control. Starting with me. 3 days later, I stood barefoot in the muddy remains of my creek bed, watching the last trickle of water disappear into the new underground pipes the HOA had ordered installed. My boots lay abandoned on the porch. There was no point keeping them clean anymore. The silence was unnerving. Gone was the soothing babble of water. Gone were the dragonflies and darting minnows. The land felt hollow, like something vital had been ripped away. I crouched down, scooping a handful of damp earth into my palm. It smelled wrong, metallic, stagnant. Without the natural flow, the soil was already turning sour. My heart ached as I imagined the tiny creatures that had once called this place home, suffocating now in the mud. And yet, a voice inside me whispered, "Physics doesn't care about bylaws. Water didn't just vanish because someone ordered it. It sought a path, always, and if it couldn't flow gently anymore, it would find another way." The first sign came during a light spring rain. Not a storm, just a soft, steady drizzle that painted the sidewalks dark and made everything smell fresh. I stood on my porch, arms folded, watching tiny rivulets form where the new drainage pipes dumped into the sewer system. At first, it seemed to work. Water pooled slightly at the curbs, then vanished down the drains. But overnight, something changed. The next morning, I woke to frantic texts from neighbors up the hill, the same neighbors who had nodded approvingly at Karen's safety plan. Basement flooding, water in the garage, puddles in the yard. Pulling on my boots, I jogged up to Maple Drive there, in front of the sparkling new homes of the HOA board members. The road shimmered with standing water geysers of muddy runoff gurgled from overloaded drains, and Richard Westfield, wearing designer loafers and a rain jacket that looked more expensive than my truck, stood ankle-deep in water, shouting into his cell phone. I leaned casually against a light pole and watched gravity, it seemed, wasn't respecting property values. That afternoon, the rain picked up, and so did the chaos. Elaine Wong, my quiet neighbor from 2 streets over, called me in a panic. "Mr. Jackson, you need to see the Thompsons' place." I grabbed my coat and sprinted through the drizzle toward their house. What I saw stopped me in my tracks. Their once pristine backyard had become a marsh. Frogs chirped loudly where grass should have been. Water pooled against their foundation, dark and ominous. Dean Thompson and his wife Sarah frantically stacked sandbags around the basement windows. Little Timmy clung to his mother's waist, sobbing, "We pumped it out twice already," Dean shouted over the rain. "It keeps coming back." I knelt beside a small stream cutting across their lawn, a stream flowing uphill from the direction of the now diverted creek. My worst fears were confirmed. By blocking the creek's natural flow, they had forced groundwater to rise, under lawns, under roads, under houses. Water always found a way. Now it was finding its way into everyone's homes. That evening, the HOA emergency chat lit up like a Christmas tree. Angry neighbors demanded explanations. Karen posted a blanket statement. "Isolated drainage issue, HOA coordinating with city officials. Please remain calm and refrain from spreading misinformation." I almost laughed. Misinformation? Gravity was not a rumor. I opened my photo folder. Pictures of flooded streets, water bubbling from lawns, dead fish littering sidewalks where the makeshift pipes had ruptured. And one perfect shot. Richard standing in a foot of water, red-faced and furious, as his neighbor's garden gnomes floated past. It was time to share the truth. I posted the entire collection in the neighborhood group, simply captioned, "When you fight nature, nature fights back." By midnight, the storm had intensified into a full-blown deluge. I lay awake in bed, listening to the thrum of rain on the roof and the distant wail of sump pumps straining against the rising tide. Somewhere down the hill, I imagined Karen sitting wide-eyed at her window, watching her empire slowly drown. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I smiled. This wasn't revenge, this was balance. The water was coming home. By sunrise, Riverstone Heights no longer resembled the quiet, orderly community Karen Westfield loved to showcase in glossy HOA newsletters. Instead, it looked like a disaster zone. Water covered half the streets, turning manicured lawns into rice paddies. Basements filled with muddy runoff. Furniture floated inside garages. Cars sat half-submerged like abandoned lifeboats. And everywhere I turned, I saw fear, then anger, on my neighbors' faces. At 9 a.m., Richard Westfield stood knee-deep in front of his $800,000 home, screaming into his phone, We're a priority, right? I know the mayor. My wife's on the chamber board. Across the street, the Thompsons loaded sodden mattresses into a rental truck, their kids huddled under umbrellas. Dean shot Richard a glare that could have peeled paint. As I passed, I heard snippets of shouted conversations. Insurance is denying the claim, says it's a man-made disaster. We're suing the HOA. This isn't a flood, it's revenge for the land. I kept my head down, snapping photos. Not to gloat, this wasn't about winning, it was about proof. Cold, hard proof for what was coming. Around noon, the HOA issued an urgent community bulletin through email and flyers jammed into mailboxes. Subject: temporary drainage disruptions. Dear residents, recent heavy rainfall combined with unexpected drainage issues has caused minor inconvenience in some areas. Please know that your HOA leadership is actively coordinating solutions with the city. We appreciate your patience during this temporary situation. Yours in service, Karen Westfield, Director of Community Standards Minor Inconvenience. I stared out at Dean's submerged grill, half underwater, and shook my head. They weren't just incompetent, they were delusional. That night, the minor inconveniences became impossible to ignore. Elaine Wong's living room flooded. The Patels had to abandon their ground floor nursery. The Jacksons' retaining wall collapsed in a spray of bricks and mud. At 7 p.m., the HOA announced an emergency meeting at the community center. Attendance was mandatory. The room was packed before Karen even arrived. I sat toward the back, watching the crowd buzz. No one chatted casually tonight. No polite smiles, just scowls, crossed arms, and whispered threats. When Karen and Richard walked in, they looked rattled. Karen's usual polished veneer had cracked, her hair frizzed from humidity, and her white blazer was splattered with mud. Richard took the podium. "We understand your frustrations," he began stiffly. "But this situation is out of the HOA's control city infrastructure." "Liar!" someone shouted from the back. A chorus followed. "You forced Jackson to kill the creek. You diverted the water. You caused this." Karen raised her gavel and banged it hard enough to crack the wood. "This is a meeting for constructive dialogue." But it was too late. The crowd wasn't interested in dialogue. They wanted accountability. When it was my turn to speak, I rose slowly, feeling dozens of eyes follow me to the front. "I warned you," I said, voice steady but sharp. "I brought geological surveys, environmental reports, expert testimonies." I pulled out the 1962 watershed map. Now enlarged on the poster board, I pointed to the blue lines, natural drainage paths, slicing right through where Karen's and Richard's luxury homes now stood. "This water," I continued, tapping the map, "has flowed through this land for centuries. You didn't erase it by burying it underground. You just trapped it until it found another way." The room was silent, save for the rhythmic drip of rain outside. Then Taylor Williams, a father whose daughter had lost her violin to basement flooding, stood up. I moved for a vote of no confidence in the current HOA leadership. Applause broke out, ragged but growing. Karen banged the broken gavel again. "You can't! This is not on the agenda!" Elaine Wong raised a printed copy of the bylaws high over her head. "Special provisions," she called out. "Section 103. In the event of gross negligence, the community can call an emergency vote without prior notice." Dozens of copies circulated instantly, printed, highlighted, ready. Karen's face was drained of color. For the first time since this battle began, the room no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the people. The vote wasn't even close. In under 15 minutes, the paper ballots were collected, counted, and announced 92% in favor of removing Karen and Richard Westfield, and the entire HOA board. The room exploded, not with chaos, but with a strange, determined energy. It was as if the neighborhood, long stifled under pointless fines and empty threats, had remembered it had a spine. For the first time in years, Riverstone Heights breathed free. Karen tried to stall. "This vote isn't legal," she shrieked. "You're ruining everything we built." But her voice was drowned out by applause. Richard grabbed her arm, whispering urgently. Karen yanked away, glaring at everyone like a cornered animal. As neighbors filed past, some shook my hand. Others simply nodded, silent gratitude in their eyes. Sarah Thompson hugged me fiercely, tears streaming down her face. "You didn't just save the creek," she whispered. "You saved our homes." The next morning, a different kind of meeting took place. A temporary leadership council was formed. Ordinary residents like Elaine Wong, Taylor Williams, and even quiet old Mr. Ramirez, who rarely left his porch before all this. Together, they set clear goals. Hire professional environmental consultants to assess proper water management. Restore the natural creek bed without delay. Audit the HOA's financials from the past 3 years. Negotiate directly with the county for assistance with drainage improvements. No power plays, no secret votes, just neighbors helping neighbors. Imagine that. Meanwhile, Karen and Richard retreated into their once grand home, curtains drawn tight. Rumors swirled that they were lawyering up, but few cared anymore. The community had moved on, without them. When the environmental experts arrived, they confirmed what Dr. Martinez and I had said from the start. Riverstone Heights was built on fragile, delicate land. Without the creek acting as a release valve, the whole neighborhood sat atop a ticking time bomb of trapped water pressure. Karen's attempt to bury nature had backfired spectacularly. It took a full month to repair the damage. Volunteers spent weekends redigging the creek's natural course. Children planted new native grasses and wildflowers along the banks. Mrs. Garcia baked pies for the workers. Teenagers lugged stones and dug trenches. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy, but it was ours. Every muddy boot print, every shovelful of dirt, every sunburnt neck and aching back. It was proof. This community wasn't just a cluster of homes anymore. It was a family. One Saturday, as we worked under the sun, little Timmy Thompson ran up holding a mason jar. "Look, Mr. Jackson," he cried. Inside the jar, a tiny frog floated happily. "They're coming back," he beamed. I knelt down, smiling so hard my face hurt. "Yeah, buddy," I said, voice rough with emotion. "They're coming home." And so were we. By the first real sunny morning in weeks, the creek was flowing again. Clear, sparkling water trickled gently over smooth stones, filling the air with the familiar, comforting murmur I hadn't realized how much I missed. The dragonflies returned first, hovering and dancing above the currents like tiny guardians. Then came the herons and the robins, drawn by the restored life of the stream. And slowly, almost shyly, the neighborhood began to heal too. It started with small things. Sarah and Dean Thompson, whose basement had flooded worst, reopened their home. The Smith kids built a rope swing over a safe stretch of the creek, and laughter once again rang across the yards. Families who had barely spoken to each other for years now gathered along the banks, helping plant trees and rebuild walkways washed out by the storms. At first, the wounds, both to the land and to the people, seemed impossible to mend. But nature, like community, has an astonishing ability to recover when given the chance. One Saturday afternoon, we held a neighborhood creek festival, a celebration organized not by any board or committee, but by the people themselves. Long tables covered in homemade food stretched along the park. Kids ran barefoot across the damp grass, chasing fireflies. Neighbors swapped recipes and garden tips. The Thompsons even led a frog-catching championship. Strictly catch and release, of course. As dusk settled in, Elaine tapped a glass for silence. "I think we owe someone a special thanks tonight," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. Before I could slip away unnoticed, a wave of applause swept through the crowd. I stood awkwardly as people clapped, hooted, even whistled, faces glowing under strings of hanging lanterns. Not for a hero, not for a savior, but for a neighbor. Just a neighbor who refused to let them drown, literally and figuratively. Later that night, after the tables had been packed away and the last embers of the bonfire smoldered, I walked down to the creek alone. The stars glittered above, reflected in the water below. For the first time since this nightmare began, I allowed myself to fully exhale. It wasn't just the land that had been saved. It was the spirit of our neighborhood, a spirit that bureaucracy, greed, and short-sightedness had tried to bury, but couldn't. Because it turns out you can't destroy what grows deep in people's hearts. You can only delay it. At the edge of the creek, I found a small hand-painted sign someone had stuck into the mud. "Welcome home, Riverstone Creek." I smiled, feeling something warm loosen in my chest. Maybe justice isn't always delivered by courts, fines, or officials. Maybe sometimes it flows slowly, winding and patient like water, finding its own way back to where it belongs. Just when it seemed the worst was behind us, the retaliation began. It started small, almost childish trash. Mysteriously appeared in my yard overnight. My mailbox, once perfectly upright, was found leaning drunkenly at an angle, as if struck by a vehicle. At first, I tried to shrug it off. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was just mischief. But deep down, I knew better. The final straw came one morning when I found my tires slashed. Again. This time, a crudely scrawled note was shoved under my windshield wiper. "Back off, or else." I stood in the driveway, the early sun catching on the jagged slashes across the rubber, feeling a grim sense of déjà vu. They were desperate now, and desperate people made mistakes. I called the police, again. Officer Jenkins arrived, taking photos and carefully bagging the threatening note. "You're rattling someone's cage pretty hard," he said with a low whistle. I forced a smile. "Good. Maybe it's about to break open." Inside, my neighbor Elaine was already brewing coffee. "I've had enough," she said fiercely, pushing a mug into my hand. "We all have." That night, a dozen neighbors gathered at Elaine's house, not to vent this time, but to organize. Sarah, Michael, the Thompsons, even Mr. Jenkins from down the block, all showed up, shoulders squared with a quiet, simmering resolve. We laid out maps and lists. We reviewed copies of environmental reports, HOA bylaws, city ordinances. We weren't fighting a personal grudge anymore. We were fighting a pattern of abuse that had finally pushed good people too far. By morning, flyers circulated the entire neighborhood. Emergency HOA recall vote, Thursday 7 p.m. Your voice matters. Your property matters. Stand up for our community. The Westfields tried to retaliate quickly. Sudden new fines appeared in dozens of mailboxes, citations for imaginary violations like excessive mailbox tilt or non-compliant mulch color. 3 families found HOA notices threatening liens on their homes for supposed unpaid fees, but it was too late. Each petty act only fueled the fire. Each threat tightened the noose, not around us, but around them. Then, a bombshell dropped. The local news station picked up our story. A hidden whistleblower, rumored to be a former HOA board member, leaked internal emails to the press. Emails showing the Westfields had been warned about flood risks months before they ordered the creek diverted, emails where they mocked concerned homeowners and joked about using fines as revenue streams. The neighborhood exploded with outrage. It was no longer just about my creek. It was about lies, about betrayal, about the arrogant assumption that nobody would dare stand up to them. 2 nights before the emergency meeting, I heard tires crunching outside. Peering through the curtains, I spotted Karen Westfield's SUV parked across the street, engine idling. For almost an hour, she sat there staring at my house. Waiting for what? I didn't know. But I didn't move. I wanted her to see that intimidation didn't work anymore. Eventually, her headlights snapped on and she roared away into the darkness. Thursday arrived. The community center, usually half empty during HOA meetings, was packed wall to wall with residents, some furious, some fearful, but all ready. Karen and Richard sat stiffly at the front table, their polished smiles brittle under the weight of so many angry stares. Mr. Gonzalez, the retired judge from down the street, took the microphone to moderate. "The people have called for a recall," he said firmly. "Tonight we vote." The votes were swift and overwhelming. Out of 212 eligible households, 187 voted for immediate removal of the entire HOA board. Karen and Richard barely waited for the final tally. They stood, gathered their papers with trembling hands, and left the room without a word. The applause that followed wasn't raucous. It was exhausted, relieved, hopeful. For the first time in a long time, Riverstone Heights belonged to the people again, not to rules, not to threats, but to neighbors who had remembered how strong they could be when they stood together. The fall of Karen Westfield and her iron-fisted HOA rule didn't happen all at once. It was more like a dam breaking, first a crack, then a roar, and finally a flood that swept everything away. The Monday after the emergency recall, subpoenas started landing in mailboxes. The district attorney's office, prompted by the leaked emails and mounting public pressure, officially launched an investigation into the Maple Valley HOA. At first, Karen and Richard tried to act unfazed. They released a carefully worded statement to the press, blaming a few disgruntled homeowners for manufactured scandals designed to smear their reputation. But behind the scenes, they were scrambling. Their home, once the crown jewel of the new development, quickly became a fortress. Curtains drawn tight, cars parked deep in the garage. Neighbors who once bragged about knowing the Westfields now crossed the street to avoid their house. Whispers filled Riverstone Heights. Over the next month, as investigators dug deeper, the true scale of the corruption became clear. Falsified environmental reports, misappropriated HOA funds, kickbacks from contractors who had won landscaping and maintenance deals. The drainage pipes they'd installed weren't just negligent, they were criminal. Several residents learned that Karen and Richard had secretly pocketed commissions from development deals while citing community improvements as the reason for absurd new fees. Meanwhile, homes continued to suffer. Families battled mold invasions, cracked foundations, and flood-damaged basements. Insurance companies refused to pay, citing unapproved structural modifications done by the HOA. One elderly couple lost everything and had to move into their daughter's apartment across town. The anger in Riverstone Heights wasn't just simmering anymore, it was boiling over. Then came the indictments. On a gray morning in late fall, two unmarked cars pulled into the Westfields' driveway. Karen, looking gaunt and pale, was led out in handcuffs, her head bowed low. Richard followed, stone-faced but deflated, like a balloon finally emptied of hot air. The sight of their arrest sent a jolt of electricity through the neighborhood. Some neighbors cheered. Others simply watched in stunned silence, knowing this moment marked the end of an era. The trial was swift. Evidence piled higher by the day. Emails, bank statements, secretly recorded conversations, sworn testimonies from former board members. Karen's defense tried to spin the story, that she only wanted to preserve property values, that she acted in the community's best interests. But it was too late. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Verdict: guilty on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and environmental violations. Karen was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Richard received 3 years, plus heavy financial restitution orders. They weren't the only ones. 2 other board members quietly accepted plea deals in exchange for testifying against them. The entire old guard of the HOA crumbled like a rotten tree. Meanwhile, Riverstone Heights transformed Elaine, now HOA president, led initiatives to restore the damaged land. Grants were secured to rebuild natural drainage systems. Families received financial settlements funded by the HOA's insurance policy and the liquidated assets seized from the Westfields. My beloved creek, once forced into hiding, was reborn. Water flowed freely again, dragonflies returned, and the laughter of children echoed across the stones as they searched for frogs and minnows. The scars would take time to heal, emotional, financial, and environmental. But for the first time in years, hope bloomed like wildflowers along the water's edge. On the 1-year anniversary of the Westfields' downfall, we held a community celebration. Neighbors brought homemade pies and barbecue. Kids raced each other across the footbridge spanning the newly restored creek. Even the mayor stopped by, praising our neighborhood for standing strong against corruption. As the sun set in a blaze of gold and crimson, I stood by the creek, watching the water sparkle as it wound its ancient path through the land. We had fought. We had endured. And, against all odds, we had won. Not because we were the loudest, not because we were the richest, but because we refused to back down when it mattered most. Because sometimes, even in the face of towering injustice, a simple, stubborn stream of truth is enough to wash the entire empire away. In life, we often believe that strength lies in walls, the rules we set, the barriers we build, the control we grasp so tightly. But real strength, the kind that endures, is quieter. It's the steady creek carving its way through stubborn stone. It's the community that refuses to be divided. It's the simple truth that flows, even when others try to dam it up. The fall of the HOA empire in our story wasn't just about legal victories or headlines. It was about neighbors remembering that they were never powerless. That injustice, no matter how carefully dressed in rules and regulations, can still be washed away when good people stand together. For those of us who have lived through many seasons, who have seen towns rise and fall, who have weathered storms not just in the sky but in our lives, this story is a gentle reminder. Nature teaches us the same lesson over and over. You cannot silence the river. You can only learn to flow with it. In a world that often feels rushed, divided, and unjust, never forget, your voice still matters, your community still matters. And sometimes, the smallest act of standing firm is what changes everything. The stream may bend, but it never breaks, and neither should we.